Join me tonight in Ecclesiastes chapter number 11. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 is where we are at as we continue on our study. We're coming to the end of it, hard to believe to some degree, but we're coming to the end of This Will Make You Happy, as Solomon has been exploring all these different thoughts that we are all prone to. What's been astonishing to me is to see the different thoughts or fallacies that he had either fallen prey to or was warning people not to fall prey to. And even thousands of years later, not just his readers, but you and I, even now in 2017, a whole continent removed, thousands of years removed, can see these exact same issues, these exact same temptations that we would want to walk in, or the same narratives we'd want to live by. And so he's just been exposing them to us, showing us what it's really like living under God who's in heaven, under the sun here amongst men. And so those two phrases have been some of his absolute favorite to utilize and employ. And so we continue on tonight in chapter 11, as last week we looked at to the issue of fleeing foolish living. And so the whole chapter was devoted to avoiding the pitfalls of foolish living, identifying it in your own heart, and then how to navigate it there amongst the culture. And so we start with chapter 11 tonight. That's broken up into two sections. We're going to look at verses 1 through 8. And it really focuses and highlights human limitations and what to do in light of those limitations. And so note what he says here in verse 1. Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 and also to 8. For thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. If the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if the tree fall toward the south or toward the north, in the place where the tree falleth, there it shall be. Now, some of these verses kind of make me chuckle. It's like, wow, what a wise guy, right? The tree's going to fall, it's going to be there. Yeah. Verse 4. He that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. As thou knowest not what is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child, even so thou knowest not the works of God, who maketh all. In the morning sow thy seed, and in the evening withhold not thine hand. For thou knowest not whether shall prosper, either this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good. Truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for eyes to behold the sun. But if a man live many years, and rejoice in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. All that cometh is vanity. Tonight we want to talk about this portion of Scripture and look at practical steps to deal with the unexpected times of life. Some practical steps to deal with the unexpected times of life. And I like the way one author put it. He talked about this whole section could be summed up with this: life, it can be risky business. And so he's trying to help us understand our human limitations in light of the world we live in, and then in light of the circumstances that will take place in your life and in my life. And so Solomon here has concluded the previous section about the need for each of us to identify and flee from foolish living. Foolishness is potent, as we saw last week. It doesn't take much to do a lot of damage. It makes our lives more difficult. It abuses the gift of speech, and it ultimately harms society from the lowest levels to the highest levels. When foolishness is unchecked and indulged in, it is detrimental to all those in society. So in general, Solomon's observations were verified by the widespread choices of humanity to embrace rather than to flee from foolish living. So due to the reality that many will live that way, Solomon then tells us in chapter number 11 here how we can live amongst such people. And so he details here an outlook for us on that we can employ practically to navigate a life filled with foolish people, but then also filled with the unknowns that are beyond our control. And you'll note that as we read through here, the passage contains several "you can know this, but you can't know that" scenarios. He wants us to see those. And I think tonight's message, particularly this chapter, is incredibly applicable and relevant for my generation on down. I think it's applicable and relevant for everyone, for sure. But I think about my generation, especially perhaps the 40 and under crowd, and it's a crowd that is petrified by anything going wrong in their life. You say, what do you mean, Pastor? There is not a week hardly that goes by, literally, that there's not some poll of Gen Xers that I think I'm an Xer or a Y, I forget, whatever 83 would make me. And Gen Xer and millennials, their greatest fear is often the fear of failure. And you can say, well, that's true of every generation, but it's heightened to the point of paralyzation in this generation. And I think perhaps it's because we're a group of optimizers that technology has let us optimize and compartmentalize to the point we are driven by a performance-based acceptance. And maybe Americans at large are leery of any screw-up, any slip-up, any mistake that would derail us from our American dream destination, our exit strategy, our end goal, our end result, that retirement down the road. And so we sometimes become paralyzed because we want risks to always be rewarded. We either don't want to make any mistakes or we never want them to end up being our own fault or to cost us anything. And Solomon's here tonight to tell us that's not a realistic outlook. That's not a healthy outlook. That's not a helpful outlook, and honestly, it is not a spiritual outlook. Even the unsaved recognize that. I read a book one time by Peter Drucker, a big leadership guru, and he said this: people who don't take risks generally make about 2 major mistakes a year. People who do take risks generally make about 2 major mistakes a year. Now, what was his point? His point was this: you're never going to be able to mitigate all risk, all issue, all calamity out of your life. It's never going to happen. And so Solomon echoed this sentiment that there are decisions to make and there are unexpected times that will come into your life. They will happen. So here's what we can do about it. So life includes the unexpected with God and man, so he gives us practical advice for navigating it. And if he was going to help us tonight, he'd say this: given our human limitations, let us be good stewards in a risky world. Given our human limitations, let us be good stewards in a risky world. How are we going to do that? What is a plan, if we could say it that way, or a practical step to deal with the unexpected times of life? How can I be a good steward in the midst of foolish living people and a God who I don't fully understand? How can I do that? Number one tonight, don't put your eggs all in one basket. Number one tonight, don't put your eggs all in one basket. Look what he says here in verse number 1 and 2. He says this: cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. What does he say here? Maybe our colloquialism would be this: don't put your eggs in one basket. Diversify. When he talks about living in a foolish world, and he talks about the unknowns of this life, and he talks about the ills that will happen, you will not be completely safeguarded from every calamity that could come your way. He says this: you need to learn to diversify, as it will insulate you against volatility. He says invest broadly. Use God's funds in a very broad manner. He starts here in verse 1 where he says, cast thy bread upon the waters, and you'll be able to find it in after a few days. There's a few different thoughts here concerning verse 1. One interprets it quite literally as throwing a flat type of matzah bread on water because it will easily be located later on. There's a good result coming. If you throw a flat piece of dry bread out there into the marsh, you should be able to find it. It's not going to go anywhere. And that's what some people would say verse 1 interprets as. But most agree that the interpretation that's accurate indicates engaging in commercial enterprises overseas. Now, before we step back and say, really, he's talking about sending grain abroad on boats? Why is that exciting? Well, remember, in their time, if you were going to get some major commerce accomplished, it was via boat. Boats were the airplanes and semi-trucks of that day, if you would. Yes, you could do it by land, and yes, a lot of commerce and merchandising took place on routes over land, but a lot of it took place overseas. Solomon himself had taken advantage of using this type of strategy in 1 Kings chapter 9 and 10. And you think about what would happen there as he would give on to... Can you turn me down a little? I feel like am I really loud to anybody else? Just me? Never mind. Maybe it's just the platform up here. He would know what it was to invest this grain. He'd have to, with patience, put it on a ship, trust those ships would reach their destination and that they would come back, and his supply would go and meet somebody else's demand, and thus it would grant him great financial prosperity. He would be rewarded with his faith and his patience in such a scenario. And so supply and demand would be very helpful to providing for his family and those around him. You could even think about Solomon's life and think about how, because he invested broadly, even utilizing his navy to do so, he was a help to the nation of Israel financially, and then he was also a help to the worship of God, not only with the temple, but also propagating the Jewish religion beyond the borders of Israel. And it happened because he invested broadly. He cast his bread upon the waters, and he was able to find it after many days. But then he goes on to say this, don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's a good thing to diversify in an unknown world. This is a practical step because multiplication grants greater protection. Multiplication grants greater protection. Note what he says here in verse 2. Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. Solomon urges the wise person to seek to multiply the channels through which they invest their assets. The term give a portion indicates granting assets or part of one's estate to others to produce financial gain. If it was land, maybe we could put it in our Ohio vernacular, it'd be like crop sharing. Solomon owns these 90 acres. He's going to farm out 45 of it to this guy, and 30 of it to that guy, and 20 of it to that guy, and do soy and wheat and corn, and that way he is completely covered as much as humanly possible against loss. And so here's what he's encouraging. Invest broadly and through multiple channels to help insulate us against the unknowns that will come. He's sure they're going to come. Note what he says at the end of verse 2. For thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. The word for evil here means this: to have distress in one's life, misery, to experience an event that causes great catastrophe, calamity, or loss or misfortune. So he highlights the reality of living under the sun with a bunch of sinners. When there are those who are dedicated to living foolishly, when those are those given over, if we can say it this way, to injustice, those who are given over to oppression in the highest levels in human experience, it's going to happen. There will be evil that comes into your life. So he says you need to insulate yourself as much as possible against it. Further than that, which he'll speak of in a moment, we don't even fully understand what God's going to allow and do in our life. There will be times that God will allow us to go through travesties. It's wise to prepare ourselves before it happens. Now, that does not mean it will keep it all from happening. It doesn't mean it will keep us from suffering any losses. It doesn't mean that there won't be perhaps times even that the believer and unbeliever alike experience some level of complete desolation. Human history, just even in our nation's short history, shows us otherwise. We can think of the Depression, the Dust Bowl era, wartime. In general, his advice is this: wise people need to prepare themselves, and they do so by diversifying themselves to avoid the volatility around them. Now, some might immediately be uncomfortable with Solomon's teaching, saying, where's the faith? And Solomon, you're telling me to invest broadly, you're telling me to diversify, you're telling me to multiply, to grant myself protection because I don't know what's coming down the road. Some might say, where is the faith? Well, Solomon's message, it's not at odds with us having faith in God as our provider. After all, true faith is not presumption. And faith in God as our provider has never excluded us, if we could say it this way, from making decisions. As you and I are created in the image of God, He gave us a free will to utilize, and it is integral to our decisions, to our faith. Far too many of God's people have, if I could say it this way, misquoted or engaged in malpractice concerning Paul's warnings about money in the New Testament. We say money's the root of all evil, and that's actually incorrect. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And yet I fear too many Christians are under the assumption that any kind of effort given towards financial sustainability, any kind of efforts given towards financial stability is loving something in this world. It is only loving it if you've loved it more than the Lord. If you've not looked at it in a spiritual light and to be used with your faith. And so Solomon says we shouldn't be consumed by finances, but neither should we be idle with finances. And so he tells us here, don't put your eggs in one basket, diversify. Diversification insulates us against volatility. But number 2 tonight, the next practical step he gives us is don't be paralyzed with what is out of your control. Don't be paralyzed by what is out of your control. Note what he says here in verse 3. If the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if the tree fall toward the south or towards the north, in the place where it falleth, there it shall be. Verse 5. As thou knowest not what is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb, even so thou knowest not the works of God that maketh all these. Now he highlights here in this portion what is well beyond any person's control or understanding. He is giving us instructions for living despite life's unpredictability. And in contrast with chapter 11's foolishness, or chapter 10's fool, a wise person will recognize their severe limitations in understanding the unpredictable world around them and the spiritual realm that's all about them. A man is ignorant of the future, but he must not allow his ignorance to make him so fearful that he becomes either careless or paralyzed. So Solomon here wants us to recognize we don't need to be paralyzed by what's uncontrollable or beyond our control or understanding. And so he gives a few illustrations of what is beyond our control to try to help us. Note what he starts off with in verse number 3. Nature is unpredictable. That which is natural around us, though it may be natural, is unpredictable. Clouds are a part of most every day, are they not? It's natural, perhaps, to see clouds for the most part anywhere in the world you live. And yet they're always changing. And if the conditions are right from rain, how many of us can stop it? The answer is nobody. I can't stop it. You can't stop it. We can't control the weather, no matter what we might want to do. But then he also gives an illustration at the other end. If clouds are always changing, he then uses a tree. And trees mostly are a little bit more permanent. You know, when you've ever seen, if any of you ever had the chance to see some of those giant redwoods, they're not going anywhere in our mind, are they? They're kind of a stationary, static item. Clouds may be ever changing, but trees are pretty permanent in their nature. But if a tree ends up falling due to circumstances, those circumstances are going to dictate where they fall. I'm not talking about somebody with a chainsaw out there. I'm just talking the storm takes it down, whatever it might be. Wherever that tree falls, as Solomon says, whether it falls north, whether it falls south, wherever it falls, it's going to be, right? And it's going to be there, and it's going to rot there, or it will be harvested there. But after it's fallen, there's not much you and I can do about it. How many of us can replant a tall, 30 or 50-foot spruce? Not without the proper equipment and a lot of hands, right? And Solomon, obviously, in his time, didn't have those items. So what's he trying to make clear? Listen, even the natural realm around you is unpredictable. But then he goes on and says, even the spiritual realm is beyond your understanding or beyond my understanding. Note what he says in chapter 5, or verse 5 here. As thou knowest not what is the way of the Spirit. Now, some might say that this is speaking of the wind, but most interpreters agree that the usage in Hebrew and then with the next section is speaking of the way in which the Spirit is in regards to the individual's body, or if I could say this way, how the soul interacts with the physical body. All spiritual beings are confined by the finite realm, and yet humanity has so little understanding of the spiritual realm and even less ability in it than we think we have. And so think about what Solomon's saying here. The natural realm is beyond your control. The spiritual realm is beyond your understanding. He goes on with another illustration. The formation of life is beyond your ability. He says in verse 5 here, verse B, or part of it, nor do we understand how the bones grow in the womb of her that is with child. The next illustration he uses is the formation of physical life within the womb of a woman. The miracle of life has been a marvel for humanity throughout human history, and we perhaps are privileged in our time that we understand more now about the formation of human life than Solomon could have understood in his day. But even with all we understand, there is still a cap or a finite limitation of which we can control it or manipulate it, right? I know we're ever pressing forward towards cloning and things of that nature, but we're always going to be, to some degree, capped in the formation of life being beyond our ability. So Solomon uses all these illustrations to come to a pinnacle in verse 5. Note what he says at the end. You don't know about where clouds come from, when they're going to rain, if they're going to rain. You can't stop them if they wanted to. You can't take care of trees whether you wanted to or not. You don't know the way the spiritual realm works. You don't even know how bodies get formed in a womb. A wonderful miracle that's been happening for thousands of years. So note what he does at the pinnacle here at verse 5 at the end. Even so, thou knowest not the works of God, who does what? Maketh them all. So he says, you don't know anything about this. You don't know anything about that. You can't control this. You can't control that. If that weren't enough, let me just remind you something. There's a God in heaven who created all these things. There's a God in heaven who is orchestrating all these things. And so if you thought the previous items were beyond your comprehension or beyond your control, God's orchestrations in your life and around your life surpass all those. Though there are items we can identify as God's work, certainly because of the revelation He's given us, much of God's work in our lives and frankly around our lives, we don't even know about. We don't understand. We can't even see the organization or operation of what God is doing all around us. And so Solomon has built this kind of pessimistic picture of look how finite, look how weak, look how limited, look how capped your experience or opportunity is. But then he gives us a practical step in light of that. Yes, you're limited. Yes, you're finite. But don't be paralyzed by that. He says, work despite all those limitations and the unpredictability of life. Note what he says here in verse 4. He that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. Verse 6, in the morning sow thy seed, and in the evening withhold not thine hand, for thou knowest not whether thou shalt prosper, either this or that, or whether they shall both be alike good. So what's Solomon's idea here? What's he trying to say to us? He says, work anyways. Work anyways. The temptation might be to be so paralyzed by worry or concern that you get little to nothing done. Note what he says in verse 4. The person might be observing the wind and not sowing because of it, regarding the clouds. It doesn't mean you're just daydreaming. He means you're so bound up. You're so worried. You're so concerned about what's beyond your control that now you're not sowing because what if it doesn't go right? What if it's the wrong time? What if it rains? What if the trees? What if this person? What if that person? He says you're not going to ever get to reap because you're so worried. You're so worked up. He says here's what you should be doing. You should be working. His advice, sow in the morning and the evening. One should be sowing when the opportunity is available and continuing to work whatever the task, because something else humans do not know is what that task, what the end of the results will be. In other words, if you can do it, you should do it, because you don't know what will or won't happen. He says here in verse number 6, you should sow in the morning, you should sow in the evening, because you don't even know whether one, both, or neither is going to prosper. You're that finite, you're that limited. So in such an unpredictable world, don't be paralyzed by what may or may not happen. You just need to work despite the unpredictability of it. You don't know what's going to happen in this life? That's fine. That's part of it. Work despite unpredictability. It could be doubly good, only partially good, or doubly bad, but you're never going to know if you don't work. You're never going to know if you don't sow. Now I would just speak to my generation for a moment. Sometimes we're so petrified about something not turning out the way we wanted to, or worse yet, we've bought into a fallacy the church has taught for far too long about the perfect center of God's will, bullseye, and we're so worried about missing that we do nothing in the meantime. And that's wrong. It's unwise. It's unhealthy. It's unhelpful. And it's unspiritual. Solomon says, listen, there are so many things beyond your control, and it's depressing if you thought about it too long. But you don't need to be depressed about it. You don't need to be frustrated or angry about it. You know what you need to do? Work. Well, what if it doesn't? Work. He's not, obviously, the whole book. He hasn't advocated just willy-nilly. Of course, he wants you to be thoughtful about it. Use the scriptures. Think about the God in heaven before you embark on an endeavor, certainly. But do something. Well, if I do that and I get at this job and it stinks, well,
It's paying your bills, so it doesn't stink that bad. Well, but it's not going to get me to retirement at age 52. Well, when you find that job, you let me know. Let everybody else in this room know too, right? It's not going to let me pay off my house at 47. It may not. But I think it's wise of us to recognize the difference between American idolatry and obsession and what real life is. And I fear that too many young people especially are idolizing something in Western consumeristic culture that their Christianity does not support. And you're going to be disappointed, you're going to be frustrated, you're going to be angry because your God is not going to meet that desire. And you can find yourself so overwhelmed and so paralyzed because your dreams are not coming to pass. And the whole time Solomon's saying this, don't live foolishly. Here's some practical steps to helping you navigate this unpredictable, unknowable life. Invest broadly. That will help insulate you. Work despite the lack of predictability in your life because you don't even know what God's going to do in your life. You don't know what's going to happen in your nation. So work hard. It's a good thing. But then lastly, he closes it with some encouragement. Life is brief, so enjoy it. Life is very brief in the scope of eternity. Enjoy it. Enjoy it circumspectly. Note what he says here in verse number 7. Truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for eyes to behold the sun. But if a man live many years and rejoice in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. All that cometh is vanity. So what does he say here to shut it down? He says, life's brief. You should enjoy it. It's good to be alive. In verse number 7, Solomon wants us to identify just how wonderful, just how enjoyable, just how blessed life is by reminding us of those blessings with an illustration of sight and sense. He says light is sweet or pleasant. In other words, it's a good thing to behold the sun. If we have eyesight, there's been a time perhaps in your life or in my life that we've got to enjoy the pleasure of seeing a sunrise and see it in its beauty. And maybe you were in this area of the world or in that area of the world, this setting or that setting, with this person or that person, but you've enjoyed what it is to be awed by the sun and its wonderful rays and how it paints a marvelous picture in the sky in rising or in setting. It's played with the clouds. It's played with the landscape. And you found yourself in awe because it was beautiful. It certainly was sweet. It was pleasant. The way it played through the spectrum of light was a wonderful thing. It's awe-inspiring. And so Solomon uses that as an illustration. The joy you had in that moment, the enjoyment you had of it, remind yourself, life's good. It is filled with blessings all around you if you'll look for them. He says life is sweet, life is precious, life is present. But then he says this though, when you're living this good life, enjoy it, but enjoy the good and the bad. Note what he says in verse 8. He adds to his statement, if a man live many years and rejoice in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. He adds to his previous statement by saying that someone could enjoy being alive for many years. And what could characterize those years, he says, is rejoicing. The word there just talks about having gladness, having fondness, having happiness. You could have many years of happiness. And while that is doable, he wants us to balance out the statement to understand, but within that, there'll be many days of darkness. Note the irony Solomon uses to contrast his statements. Rejoice in many years, but in those years, you will have days of darkness. And so what does he call us to do in verse number 8? He says, remember. Remember. What is he saying? He wants you and I to remember, to have this as our central thought, to have this in our mind to help us interpret when making decisions or interpreting what's taking place around us. Remember, you have had great years of rejoicing, happiness, and blessings. You're going to have some dark days, though. And those dark days are going to come. And they'll make an impact to where sometimes, frankly, some of those years of rejoicing can be almost laid aside or almost forgotten because the dark days are so heavy. He says, my friend, take the good and the bad. Remember, you'll have years of rejoicing and a few days of darkness. But he goes beyond this, really, because in this book, light and darkness, years and days have been used to discuss the span of life or time and of death. So in short, Solomon reminds us that we're only alive for a little bit, like a sun rising and a sun setting. And he says, though it may seem like years to us, he says, the two sides or the bookends of before your birth and after your death, eternity, are a very long time. You'll have that longer than anything else. We as humans are prone to think we will continue forever, and it's just not going to happen. Those years are going to shoot by, my friend. The days of darkness or death does come for all of us. And so it all comes to a close at some point. And that's why he says at the end of verse 8, all that cometh is vanity. So much of what we will live this life for many times in this unpredictable world, often we'll make choices to live for that which doesn't matter. That's which fleeting, that which is worthless. So it's important for each of us as readers of Solomon to heed his wisdom about living this brief and yet enjoyable life. It will feel like years to us, but they'll be so fast, and it'll be so quick. He says it's wise to live them wisely because they will fade away. My friends, tonight, we're called to live a life of faith, follow an unseen God through a life filled with wicked individuals and filled with times that we will not understand. So that life requires divine assistance. It requires divine wisdom. It is not a life that will be lived without problem, and it is not a life that can be lived perfectly. It can be lived with wisdom seen in handling our material blessings, our ability to work, and utilizing the times of our life. Like the way one famous concert pianist said, he said this, "Of course, there's no formula for success except perhaps an unconditional acceptance of life and what it brings." And I would agree with him because he's agreeing with Solomon. You don't know what's coming down the road, and neither do I. We can't control what those around us will do or won't do. We have very finite limitations on what we understand and can change in our own life. And then on top of all that, we have a God who is orchestrating in that work in ways we don't know, don't understand, and sometimes we aren't even going to like or appreciate. So what do we need to do? Some practical steps. You invest broadly. Don't put all your eggs in one basket financially or in your investment with others. Invest broadly, my friends. And then beyond that, work hard. Work and don't be afraid of failure and of risks that you take because, my friends, at the end of the day, there's so much beyond your control. You could be paralyzed forever about all of it. You just need to do something for the glory of God and for the provision of your family and for the betterment of the gospel. Then he says, enjoy your life. Live it. It's going to go fast, so enjoy it. Don't enjoy it in hedonistic fashion, but enjoy it in an understanding that I live before the God who is in heaven, and I need to be living to make a difference in the affairs of those who are under the sun here. And I'm never going to have a perfect life, and to expect that and desire that and wish that is foolishness and will only make me angry or it'll only make me discouraged. He says, you can't live an unpredictable life with predictability. What you can do, though, is trust your God, take these practical steps, and go forward. Life is risky business sometimes, and it does not always pan out the way we want it. So given our human limitations, let's be good stewards. Let's use the wisdom that God has granted us in His revelation and His Word and make good decisions that please Him, that honor Him as best as we're able and know how with His grace, and make a difference with those around us as well. But my friends, you're going to have unexpected times. There's only so much you can do on this side of heaven, but what you can do with God, His help, and His Word should be done. Don't be discouraged, frustrated, or disappointed about what can't change or what cannot be done as well. Father, would you just help us tonight as we have your word here, and it does run contrary to our Western idea. It runs contrary to what our desire would be even. We want a problem-free plan. that goes the way we expect it to go, and everybody's going to do exactly how we expect. We're going to have a family that goes the way we expect. We're going to have friends that go the way we expect, and employers and employees that go the way we expect, and our finances, and our house values, and our retirement plan, and the stock market, and everything's just going to work out great, we think. And though we sometimes, if we were honest, we'd verbalize and say, well, of course I don't believe that. But in our heart, there is a deceptive nature here in Western culture that expects that. So may we agree with your word tonight that that's not going to happen. And it's okay. It's not a problem. It's not angering. It's not discouraging. So may we invest broadly with people, places, and things. May we work diligently, no matter what unpredictable items might come or undesirable items happen. May we be diligent in our work. And may we choose to enjoy our life, the good and the bad. It's going to go so quickly. May we not waste it in vanity and hedonistic living. May we not lose out on what you're wanting to do by self-led, worthless living in your realm. May we live it out for your honor and your glory, the good and the bad here on this earth. So, Father, we need your help tonight. Ask for any individual in the room who maybe is struggling because of their life and their situation and where they're at. What took place either with their job or a relationship or with their health, something that didn't pan out the way they'd hoped to with their finances. Lord, I don't know, but I do know that you can help them tonight to find your help, and then they can just follow some practical steps to be a good steward. Doesn't mean that we aren't going to let these things happen or that they are not going to happen to us, but Lord, just be a good steward so we can be a difference maker for you in this life. People can see your grace at work in our life even when things aren't going well. So Lord, I ask that you'd help us with this tonight. In Christ's name, amen. I want to give you a moment. We'll have the piano play, and as it does, I do just want to give you a moment because I do find that this passage does run quite contrary to our thinking. We don't like the idea of life not going the way we want it to, especially in America as a very prosperous nation. So I want to just give you a moment. Maybe there's some area of your heart tonight that you're struggling with against the Lord. Maybe some area of your life you know that it hasn't gone the way you want, and we need to come to terms and settle that with the Lord in His care. Maybe you want to pray for somebody else who's in that same situation. Let's just take a moment tonight and have some prayer. Let's go ahead and stand as Brother Jordan leads us in a song of praise as we're dismissed tonight. We look forward to seeing you Sunday.
You turn in your hymnals to hymn number 47, Like a River Glorious. We're just going to sing the first and second verse as we dismiss from church tonight. Hymn number 47, Like a River Glorious. like a river glorious is God's perfect peace, over all victorious in its pride increase. Perfect yet it floweth, fuller every day. Perfect yet it groweth, deeper all the way. Stayed upon Jehovah, hearts are fully blessed, finding as he promised, perfect peace and rest. Every joy or trial falleth from above, traced upon our tile by the Son of Love. We may trust him fully, all for us to do. They who trust him wholly find him wholly true. Stayed upon Jehovah, hearts are fully blessed, finding as he promised, perfect peace and rest. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week.